Trav SD here, and thank you, Niles. It's such a privilege to be at your Charlie Chaplin days, or not actually there, actually, you're in my house right now. Normally, I do these video presentations in front of this poster I have of Buster Keaton's The General, but somehow that seemed kind of wrong for Charlie Chaplin days. So instead, I chose this picture of Louise Brooks, who I think we all agree is very decorative. And she, I believe, had an affair with Charlie during the Follies days, so I'm sure he would not object to us including her in the back. Also, significance is that this collage was made by Marlene Weissman, whose name you might not know, but whose work you probably know if you're a fan of Ben Modell and his projects like The Silent Clowns and Undercrank Productions. She does the graphic work for him. So, Charlie Chaplin and vaudeville. Chaplin is the literal product of vaudeville's close sibling, English music hall. English music hall came about in the mid-19th century in pubs. Always at the center were singers of sentimental ballads and funny comic songs. That was true of vaudeville too, to a much greater degree than most people know, but it was literally true of music hall. By the last quarter of the 19th century, music hall had progressed from pub entertainment to large purpose-built theaters, built especially for the purpose of doing these shows. And they had stars, big stars like Gus Ellen and Marie Lloyd and Dan Leno were coming to the fore. By the early 1880s, Charles Chaplin Sr. and Hannah Hill, aka Lily Harley, met when they were cast in a comedy sketch called Seamus O'Brien, which I'm sure was very respectful to the Irish. That's my wife, by the way. She's here to, I don't know, be an audience, be a live body. And that's her print behind me. Both Charles Chaplin Sr. and Lily Harley were both entertainers in the conventional music hall mold. They both had solo acts, and they sang songs and did funny patter. And, in music hall, as in vaudeville, you try to distinguish yourself with originality of material and the strength of your personality. Marie Lloyd, for example, had these buck teeth that come across even in still photos to this day. She had a lot of personality. Charlie's father was much more successful than his mother. He popularized some songs and wound up on the cover of sheet music, which was kind of the gold standard back in those days for fame. Then he had songs like A-Boys and The Girl Was Young and Pretty, which doesn't that sound like a Chaplin? So Charles Sr. was so popular that by 1890 he actually made a tour of American vaudeville, which was then in its infancy. The great circuits we know about, which were the hallmark of vaudeville, had not yet been established, but it was beginning to develop its unique character at certain key venues in major U.S. cities like New York and Boston and San Francisco. One key difference between English music hall and vaudeville was music hall retained its pub culture. So at an English music hall, you could go get a drink at the bar, for example, and the songs were kind of naughty. There could be some risque jokes. Vaudeville justified its existence in puritanical America by distancing itself from that. So, though it had originally come from saloons too, in the hands of its key innovators like Tony Pastor and B.F. Keith, it disavowed liquor, any sort of crudity or sexual suggestiveness. Tony Pastor's was located literally at Tammany Hall in Union Square. Pastor had started at saloons, but had a background in the circus. He worked for P.T. Barnum when he was younger. Barnum was a teetotaler, and he presented Jenny Lind, for example, and that kind of set a template. Pastor imported many British music hall singers, but there was also a bit of circus in his shows in general, and one thinks of greater diversity in the kinds of acts in American vaudeville than you would get in English music hall, and certainly greater ethnic diversity, Irish, German, African American, Jewish, both in the performers and the audiences. 2 decades later, our Charlie, Charles Jr., would tour American vaudeville, so let's get to him. Charles Sr. and Mrs. Chaplin drifted apart pretty quickly due to all of the well-known foibles of showfolk. Both parents actually suffered from the sins that those prudish Americans were so judgy about. So Chaplin's mother was not very monogamous. Chaplin's older brother, Sidney, his half-brother, had a different father, despite the fact that she was with Charles Sr. at the time. And that happened again with Leo Dryden, Charlie's other half-brother. But by the same token, Charles Sr. was an alcoholic. So they drifted apart when Charlie was very young, and Charlie was raised by a single mother. Unfortunately, she wasn't successful, and she was not nearly as successful as Charles Sr. Her stage name, by the way, was borrowed from the Jersey Lily, Lily Langtry. There's a great BBC, or a mediocre BBC, biopic series about her that's fun to watch. One gets the impression that her act was not as impressive as Charles Sr.'s. So when Charlie was very small, Lily claimed to have lost her voice, and she stopped working, and she kind of went slowly mad. This is well-known stuff. I'm just introducing it to explain why Charlie went and became a variety performer at such a young age. It was kind of financially necessary. But also, Charlie's mother seems to have been his first teacher, and she was much more like him, personality we know of Charlie Chaplin, than Charles Sr., despite being the namesake. So the mom taught him to clown and do impressions and sing and dance and get his first skills. So he sang for coins at an amateur night in a music hall when he was about 5. When he was about 8 or 9, his dad got him a job in an act called the 8 Lancashire Lads, in which he clog danced. Clogging, if you don't know, was very popular English and Irish and Scottish type of folk dance, which in the hands of African Americans sort of merged and became what we know as tap. They wore these wooden shoes and made these big impressive sounds when they danced. His mom pulled him out of this fairly successful gig after a couple of years, but during that time Charlie would have been on bills with famous performers like Dan Leno and George Roby and Little Tish, and he would have been able to watch these guys. Dan Leno, of course, was the most famous sort of comic performer in vaudeville and music hall and pantomime. Was famous for his drag performance. George Roby was largely a comic singer. And Little Tish was a little person who wore these big, big shoes and had a whole comic routine of funny stuff he would do with these shoes. So Chaplin watched those. But then there were these awful years when he was a tween, when he had to fend for himself. He was homeless, worked in a factory, the Dickensian aspects of his upbringing. Then Sidney hooked him up in some legit plays. He was in Sherlock Holmes for a couple of years with the famous actor William Gillette. He did an adaptation of Horatio Alger. He was in burlesque. He played a character known as Sam Cohen, the Jewish comedian, which did not go over well with Jewish audiences. He was in an act called Casey's Court Circus, and in that one he did a sketch where he impersonated a famous charlatan known as Dr. Walford Bodie. Bodie was the famous sort of quack doctor at the time who had these cures of electricity that he would effect, and he sold all of these notions and things. So Charlie, it was topical material that Charlie imitated. Then finally in 1908, his brother Sidney got him a job with Carnot's Speechless Comedians. By this point, Carnot's act was 20 years old and was considered one of the first and best of music hall's comedy acrobat acts. Probably the first of those had been the Hanlon Brothers, aka the Hanlon Lees, who performed in circuses, music hall, and cabarets and vaudeville in the UK, France, and the US. The Hanlons influenced the American Byrne Brothers, who in turn influenced W.C. Fields, and I think also Buster Keaton. And naturally, the three Keatons were another act of this type. But the Byrne brothers were famous for having all of these contraptions, like trapdoors and crazy ladders and things. That's one reason I think they influenced Keaton. There were also the Lupino family, Lupino Lane and Wallace Lupino, who some of you may know from silent films, came up in that act. And another one called Willie, West, and McGinty, which went as late as the 1950s. If you go on YouTube, you can see some clips of them on the Ed Sullivan Show. So these troupes would perform elaborate, complicated, intricate sketches with physical comedy. They do tumbling and pratfalls and other stunts. Some of the more circus-oriented acrobatic ones would incorporate things like trapeze and teeterboard stuff. But Carnos was narrowly focused on physical comedy. Every member of the company was drilled and could play every part in every sketch. And Chaplin was such a genius at this kind of thing that he ended up being the star of the company within 2 years. And his name would be advertised in the ads, and people would come specifically to see him. Now we're going to go to part 2, and I hope you'll return for that.